today we're joined by Professor Stephen Justice of the University of California at Berkeley and the University of Mississippi. And he's really just one of the most exciting people in the field, and somebody whose work I've always found just energizing for its intellectual seriousness and its capaciousness. His first book, Writing in Rebellion, England in 1381, came out with University of California Press in 1994. And it's perhaps the best of the new historicist works in medieval studies, partly because it moved beyond using history as a way of opening up literature for us. It did that, but it really treated took both literary and historical methods, brought them to bear on a range of writings. I mean, it's called Writing and Rebellion for a reason, rather than Literature and Rebellion, because he's looking at just a huge range of kinds of writing and thinking about the cultural and political work that they were doing in really exciting ways. In and around the English Rising of 1381, that event that used to be called the Peasants' Revolt. Because the work was really interested in a kind of cultural and political imaginary that was getting developed, it did aspire to the analysis of culture and politics as such in a way that a lot of new historicist work really didn't. So that was a very exciting moment. But the really great thing about Steve is that he's never been a prisoner of his own critical terms and methods. So I remember seeing him give a talk at Kalamazoo in which he did just a really sharp analytical attack on many of the methodological and motivational underpinnings of new historicism, and tried to that talk was one of a number of ways in which he's tried to open up the field to historically responsible but new ways of doing our work, and in doing so, he's pursued a number of different paths. One is to think more about literary history proper. So he's published essays on Chaucer, on Langland, and a book that's now coming out on Adam Usk, which are really trying to reinvigorate part of the larger movement to try to reinvigorate literary history proper in the post-New Historicist moment. He's also engaged in really wide-ranging work on medieval religious culture, and today's talk is going to be part of that. There's a larger project that this talk is in some ways part of, and in some ways helping to shift and redirect, that at one point anyway, Steve was calling "Did the Middle Ages Believe in Their Miracles?", which is the name of a brilliant essay of his in Representations from 2008. I strongly recommend that. That essay takes a really sort of razor-sharp analytic look at the terms within which historians and critics have tried to think about the problem of religious belief in the Middle Ages, and Steve concludes that really at every step of the way there's the replication of a kind of deadlock between, on the one hand, the thought that people in the Middle Ages must have been rubes, must have been sort of naive, unable to make the kinds of common sense distinctions that we all make. On the one side, or on the other side, that they were so self-consciously conniving and political and manipulative in relation to this thing that one might call belief, that they were really putting it to other uses in a self-conscious way, and that neither of these possibilities could possibly do justice to the phenomenon of religious belief in the Middle Ages, and that both rely on the thought that when that what religious belief fundamentally is a particular kind of cognitive state, And what Steve does in that essay is to argue that just can't be right, and to draw from Aquinas and some other figures an alternative way of thinking of belief as really much more about the relationship between the intellect and the will, and a site of real inner strife as a result. So in that sense, his work tries to open up sites of turmoil and contestation in what others might see as a more placid field, but to do so in ways that are true to the intellectual work and the cultural work that his texts are pursuing. So he's not at all reductive in relation to those texts, but just has a really incredible generosity and respect for the work that those texts are doing, which is one of the best things about his work. So I'm really looking forward to the talk today. I'll let you state the title because I forgot to write it down. I apologize, but please join me in welcoming Steve Justice.
Guy doesn't get that nice an introduction every day. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm a little embarrassed to be reminded that some years ago at Kalamazoo I was attacking some aspects of New Historicism, because I have a feeling that I'm going to discover as I read this lecture today that that's what I'm doing again. And this is, I should say that and thank you to the Lumen Christi Institute for bringing me, and all of you for coming. When Thomas Levergood and I talked about this, we did agree it would be an academic lecture. And that's what it is. I realized with embarrassment as I walked up to this building and saw a little poster with the title that I had given, which I think is Shameless, the History of a Pejorative from St. Augustine until now, that it sounds like it's going to be telling a broader and probably more interesting story than it's actually going to tell. So if any of you are getting something that is different from what you thought you were going to get, I will not be shocked if you leave. However, I am going to be talking, I'm going to start out by talking about something on which both students and general readers on the one hand, who find themselves reading works from the long history of Western Christian thought, and scholars of that thought on the other, tend to be in agreement. And that is what we might describe as the tone of the unapologetic zest for vilification in the intellectual and devotional literature of pre-modern and early modern and most of modern Christianity as well, the vicious fights, and in which figures will get involved with each other, and the viciousness with which they seem to conduct those fights. Even readers who gamely and generously open up translations of St. Augustine or St. Bernard or almost any such figure are often taken aback. This sounds like I'm just about to start feedback. Is this seem too loud? Okay, I get hectoring easily, so if I sound hectoring, please let me know. They're often taken back to find a sort of chronic belligerence that sounds at once savage, evasive, and a little sick. There's plenty of scholarship and criticism for the last 200 years that would be happy to tell them that it is kind of savage, and scholarship of the last 30 years or so is downright eager to tell us that it is, in fact, evasive and sick. But that's not because this belligerence, this tone, is often looked at directly. Normally it remains a phenomenon of the middle range, you might say, a medium through which we apprehend the works that we read from these periods, rather than something that is itself apprehended. I want to try today making it, this tone, this atmosphere, this belligerence, and especially one word that represents that, the object of apprehension. And think about it, and think about how we medievalists, we literary critics and cultural historians process and respond to it. So it's one particular expression of that tone that I want to discuss today. And that's the readiness of religious writers in these centuries, almost unanimously, to decry their opponents and their opponents' words as impudent, as shameless. I'm going to be using these synonyms interchangeably in the lecture, but they will always be translating the same forms of the same Latin term, impudens. Choosing this word allows me, first of all, just to focus the discussion a little bit, philologically, on concrete instances of use and meaning. But I also think it's a great word to focus on, because it condenses into a single lexical unit what strikes almost all of us as a chronically prissy defensiveness in the tone of medieval religious writing. Let me start by giving you 3 examples of that word and that tone. Early 5th century, St. Augustine, toward the end of his life, is engaged in a fierce exchange with the Pelagian bishop Julian of Eclanum. Julian has twitted Augustine with at once hating sex and talking obsessively and indecently about it. Julian has noted that even Adam and Eve had the decency to cover their nakedness. Augustine fires back at him, "It is worse to praise what they felt in their shame than to strip it bare, you most shameless man." Impudentissime. Early 14th century. Some women religious have relaxed their observance of the cloister. Pope Boniface VIII declares that they have impudently discarded the modesty of nuns, and he orders them back to their convent, to go back to their convents and stay there. 18th century. Vincenzo Ludovico Gotti, cardinal priest of St. Pancras, has read Spinoza. He finds that Spinoza denies the gospel's resurrection account, says that it cannot be believed, that the apostles who claimed to see the resurrection were deceived. Gotti fires back, "It is you who are deceived, you most impudent of mortals." Let's call this tactic of denunciation the impudence gambit. Notice how it works. It rejects a claim, an argument, as not just erroneous but as unworthy. It's unapologetically ad hominem. It implies that failure of thought has followed from some failure of character. It implies further that the thought doesn't rise even to the status of rationally refutable error. It's a subrational animus on which argumentative attention would be wasted. So the accusation of impudence peremptorily refuses to continue discussion as a waste of reason on the unreasonable. That refusal makes it easy for us, scholars, looking at this material, to hear in it that shrill defensiveness that I was talking about at the beginning and to suspect it as the bad faith tactic of an orthodoxy ready to defend itself by bullying when it can't defend itself by persuasion. When baffled how to respond, declare your opponent beneath response. And so it's easy to conclude that the shrillness is a symptom, a sign, that a sore spot has been touched, that religious belief has been provoked into lashing out against challenges real or imagined that it cannot answer in any more rational way. So, for example, in the case of Boniface VIII's canon criticizing the nuns who have impudently cast off the modesty of nuns, 2 very good historians, James Brundage and Elizabeth Mikowski, say that this shows Pope Boniface's obsession with female sexual purity. In the case of Cardinal Gotti, calling Spinoza impudent for doubting the resurrection, Jonathan Israel's monumental study, Radical Enlightenment, 2000, has a little fun with him while drawing a similar judgment. At this point in his book, Israel is claiming that Orthodox churchmen have been rattled, knocked off their balance by Spinoza's religious skepticism. As he concludes his chapter, he quotes first Henry Moore, calling Spinoza impudent, and concludes with Gotti doing the same. Here I'm quoting Israel for the next sentence. Cardinal Gotti, among others, reiterated the stock reply. The truth of the testimony of the evangelists cannot be doubted. For good measure, echoing Henry Moore's designation of Spinoza, you, the most impudent of mortals. And he ends his chapter there. The effect is to strand Gotti in mid-bluster, to portray him as a pathetic figure who wants to refute but can only fume. What Gotti wants to think is a response to Spinoza is something Israel assumes we can diagnose as the sign of his anxiety and helplessness, his unconscious admission that he has no response with which to withstand the withering power of Spinoza's claims. Now, Israel is quite an old-fashioned historian, and I mean that description as honest praise. That he so unselfconsciously uses this little device testifies what a very familiar move such an abrupt diagnosis of anxiety in historical sources has become. It's been, for the last 3 generations, an interpretative tactic ubiquitous in those styles of literary and cultural history that range themselves under the broad rubrics of critique and historicism. See, I told you I'd be getting at historicism again. The styles that work to read sources against the grain, as we used to say, to move past what the authors we study want us to see in order to find instead what they don't want us to see or what they don't see themselves about the conditions that their discourse presupposes, the interests it serves, the fragile grounds on which its certainties rest. One quick and easy way to do that has been to locate in moments like the ones that I quoted, as Israel does in Gotti, as Brundage and Mikowski do in Boniface VIII, and as pretty much everybody and his cousin does with Augustine, moments in which they seem to claim rational procedure but display instead a sub-rational animus, a twitch of orthodox defensiveness against skeptical inquiry. To claim that it is therefore empty of ideational substance, that therefore it is therefore beneath analysis, argumentative analysis, that therefore diagnosis and not argument is called for. Gotti, for example, is useful to Israel, as Israel presents him, because he's not just wrong. He can be taken to represent the whole opinions of a whole class of orthodox clerical thinkers, and he is so haplessly wrong that he lets slip how fragile his intellectual confidence and their intellectual confidence is. Okay, let's call this interpretative tactic the anxiety gambit. And of course, my point is how it looks a little bit like the impudence gambit that it diagnoses. Indeed, you can see it as a kind of standoff. Gotti calls Spinoza impudent. We call Gotti scared. This coincidence can give us a clearer view, I think, of both gambits. That is, both this tone in medieval, late antique and medieval and early modern religious writing, and also the habit of modern critics and cultural historians to diagnose what they find as anxieties in the sources that they read. To give us, in particular, a clearer view of what is right and what is wrong with how cultural and literary scholarship has come to be written in the last decades. What I've started calling the anxiety gambit in contemporary scholarship is so familiar, so nearly mechanical a reflex to those of us who have used it that we rarely think about it. And one of the things we don't think about is how little evidence and how little thought we generally feel we're required to bring to bear in order to deploy it. No particular grounds seem needed to justify the judgment that we are finding anxiety in a given text. The grounds are assumed to be obvious without further comment. In Israel's treatment of Gotti, the mere fact of accusing him of impudence counts as evidence of it, but almost anything can be taken without elaboration or explanation to signal anxiety in an author in whom you are disposed to find anxiety. So, careless treatment of a topic can signal anxiety. Carolyn Dinshaw has said that a wild accusation of homosexuality in a Middle English screed shows how worried its author is about homosexuality. But then, careful treatment of something can also be a signal of anxiety. I myself claimed that one chronicler meticulously documented his monastery's landholding because he was scared witless by how tenuous their claims were. A deep concern with what you are studying can signal anxiety. Catherine Kirby Fulton has said that a medieval commentator gives a pedantically orthodox account of an obviously heretical book because he is panicked by its heresies. But then an airy unconcern can signal anxiety also. Stephen Greenblatt says you can tell how anxious Poggio Bracciolini is about Lucretius's ideas because he shows no interest in them. You're scared of something if you correct someone's incoherence or extravagance, but you're scared of something if you are incoherent or extravagant yourself. If you think the practice is wrong, you're afraid of that practice. If you think that a position or a claim is wrong, you're afraid of that position or that claim. And for that matter, you show yourself anxious about something if you don't mention it at all. I could find you a dozen scholars within an hour who speak of anxieties witnessed by their unspeakability, and I could find you hundreds who are willing to treat criticism of something as transparent evidence of anxiety about that thing. In other words, the anxiety gambit comes cheap. You don't have to give reasons for calling a remark anxious. You can assume that all readers will accept that it is so, and yet it is offered as a substantive, not merely a decorative assertion. If Dinshaw says that the 12 Conclusions accusation of homosexuality is anxious, if I say the same thing about Walsingham's inventory of his monastery's land, neither of us is just painting a mood, the way you might talk about a merry retort. We are both advancing interpretations of a particular kind. We and all the scholars I've cited are claiming that the anxiety in each case is the most important thing to notice about the text, that it displaces the content or the meaning that its author intended, and therefore that author is phased or defensive. The point is that the author is not in control of her assertion. When she thinks when we're diagnosing an author as being anxious in this way, when she thinks she is reasoning, she's really just rationalizing. When she thinks she's responding, she's avoiding response. And that this points beyond the individual author, witnesses to something more general, witnesses to a structural difficulty or an incoherence, a guilty awareness, an unspoken sense of vulnerability in the position occupied. The real function of the reasons or the stories or the principles or the narrative accounts is to neutralize or manage the anxiety. And so as reasons or principles or narrative accounts, they turn out misshapen, failed reasons and incoherent stories. And the point of saying that is to suggest the misfired utterances of these individual authors represent, metonymically you might say, the incoherence of their own ideological or social structural position. What they feel as anxiety is a clue to the vulnerability of their ideology to what it can't explain. Now, this anxiety gambit is, as I say, so utterly familiar to us that we accept it naturally and without explanation, not only in our scholarly work, but just in our everyday exchanges as well. Somebody's touchy. The impudence gambit is on the other hand, is so distant and alien that we resort to the anxiety gambit to explain it, and yet they look a lot alike. Okay, in discussing this, finally, after those introductory gestures, we're going to spend a lot of time with St. Augustine for the next few minutes, because the kind of judgment that I just said we find it easy to allege against medieval authors is one that has for centuries been an easy accusation to allege against Augustine of Hippo. The beginning of the 18th century, Pierre Bayle said that Augustine makes terrifying monsters of the smallest errors, and so will stoop to the lowest sophistries to contain them. At the end of the 20th century, William Connolly said that Augustine manifests a nasty play of prurience and shame that demonstrates the surge of anxiety he experiences in the face of defense and a readiness in the face of dissent and a readiness to silence dissent by the most brutal means. He has so often been diagnosed with a defensive anxiety, in large measure because there are so many passages that seem to lend color to such a diagnosis. So many passages where we might find the first stirrings of a coercive impulse in an accusation of impudence. Let's take an example. In Book 7 of the Trinity, the De Trinitate, he quotes St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, calling Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. There's a puzzle here, he says. The verse seems to imply that without Christ, God would lack power and wisdom. But that can't be right. To conclude that would be impious, he says. How do we avoid concluding it? Someone might suggest that we just say that Paul was wrong, that we resist the apostle, as he puts it. But that, he says, would be impious and also impudent. Looking just at those two sentences alone, it looks as though impiety, as he uses it, denounces an unworthy thought about God, while impudence denounces an unworthy thought about authority, and that the charge of impudence, therefore, is meant to silence such a thought without answering it. Taken alone, it's not a pretty passage, and it seems to confirm the frequent suspicion that Augustine wishes to bury awkward questions about the Bible under a heap of shame. But this can't be right. For later in the same work, he uses an identical judgment of impudence in a context that this explanation could not cover. In Book 15 of the De Trinitate still, he's discussing the Pyrrhonist claim that nothing at all can be known with certainty, and is offering some counterexamples to examples of what he says can be known with certainty. Twice in two sentences, he plays the impudence card. If someone says to you, he says, "I wish to be happy," would it not be impudent to reply, "Maybe you're mistaken"? Again, if someone were to say, "I do not wish to be wrong," would it not be most impudent to say to him, "Perhaps you are wrong about not wanting to be wrong"? Now, these cases are like the one I cited a moment ago, in that what they are calling impudent is a doubt. They differ because in this case, the doubt is not of any religious authority. It's simply doubting anyone's report of certain kinds of thought. But in fact, it's easy to show that this last pair of uses are not about authority at all, And then we can see that the same explanation applies to the assertion that there would be impudence in resisting St. Paul. Let me show you how this works. The two assertions he says it would be shameless to question are, I want to be happy, and I do not want to be wrong. In fact, these are assertions that often in his works, Augustine uses examples of utterances whose contradictories can never be true. You yourself cannot intelligibly doubt that you want to be happy and want to be correct. If you think you do, you misunderstand what you mean by such statements. Since you cannot coherently doubt these statements for yourself, neither can anyone else doubt them for you, about you, and can't doubt them, in fact, about anyone. And that's clearly what Augustine means by calling such a doubt impudent. It is impudent, not because it's a bold retort that questions authority, but because it's an incoherent retort that questions what cannot meaningfully be questioned. A moment's reflection shows that it's the same case in the first passage I cited, the one in which he says it would be impudent to doubt St. Paul. Think of the context. The topic under discussion is the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. Augustine, like all later commentators, agreed that this doctrine was unavailable to natural reason and could therefore be known only by revelation. So for that discussion of the nature of the Holy Trinity, the acceptance of revelation is formally presupposed. To hold a view about the nature of the Trinity is to accept the existence of the Trinity and therefore to accept the authority of the revelation that proposed it. It would be incoherent then to reject that revelation when it becomes inconvenient. So far, so good, but there has to be more to it than that. If Augustine simply means incoherence when he says impudence, he could just say incoherence. Two further passages, these in the City of God, help to clarify. In chapter 23 of book 15, this is a famous passage really, he discusses those sons of God who are said in Genesis 6 to have mated with the daughters of men. Who were these sons of God? He briefly entertains the possibility that they were angels, and so he asks, can spirits experience sexual appetite and satisfy it? He says there's some evidence that they can. Roman myths spoke about the freedoms that incubi took with mortal women. And he continues, the Gauls say the same thing about the spirits they call dousii, as attested, he says, by witnesses so numerous and of such quality that to deny it would seem impudent. Why does he say that would be impudent? Obviously, there's no question of religious authority here. Augustine is not a defender of pagan lore. Nor in this case would there be a formal incoherence in denying the Gauls' testimony, even if it is true, since it's not axiomatically true that dousii have sex with mortal women, and it's not presupposed by the question. Nor is it axiomatic that witnesses, even trustworthy witnesses, must always be credited. What's left? Clearly, what he means by impudence in this case is simply rejecting testimony that seems worthy of being accepted on no grounds other than an inability or an unwillingness to imagine it. The shame that it lacks, that this shamelessness lacks, is shame at asking for empirical evidence and then rejecting without grounds when you get it. In other words, impudence is incoherence and then something more. It's a slovenly habit of mind, a bluff assurance that is heedless of logical consequence in the conditions of responsible assertion. The impudent man is one so sure of his instinctive responses that he will reject claims for no reason more compelling than mere personal incredulity. To argue impudently is to ignore the conditions that by arguing you bind yourself to respect. So, to speculate about the divine persons while rejecting the authority of Scripture is to hollow out the ground you stand on. To ask if there is evidence that angels can have sex and then to disqualify the evidence because it says they can is to swap premises on a whim. In fact, in empirical questions like this, the avoiding impudence requires a kind of self-surveillance, a vigilance, even a kind of skepticism. Let me show you what I mean with the second passage from Book 15 of the City of God. This one's in chapter 9, and it's even better known than the one that I just discussed. Here, Augustine is discussing the great ages that Genesis claims the early patriarchs of the Old Testament achieved. These, he says, are hard to believe, but that doesn't make them untrue. He draws an analogy. Virgil says that men of the heroic age were gigantic in size and power. Turnus, in his last battle in Book 12 of the Aeneid, hoists up a rock which Virgil says, 12 picked men now could barely support, so weak are the bodies that earth now produces for men. This is hard to believe too, Augustine says, and many disbelieved it without qualm, but Ancient tombs, laid open by earthquakes, erosion, and similar accidents, he says, have convinced the well-informed. I myself, he says, saw on the shore of Utica a human molar so huge that were it chopped down to the measure of our teeth, it seemed able to make 100 of them. This is only an analogy with the case of the biblical patriarchs' long lives, and the analogy works like this. Instinctively, we dismiss as absurd what Virgil says about Turnus's size. But physical evidence has survived accidentally to prove that our instinct was wrong. Instinctively, we dismiss as absurd what Genesis says about Methuselah's age. In the nature of this case, no physical evidence could survive, that is, dimension in time doesn't leave fossils. But the instinct is as vulnerable in this case as it was in the other. Thus, he goes on to say, we are the more impudent in not believing, the more surely we find fulfilled what we were already told. That is, in that difficult sentence, which I think is always mistranslated. I think this is what Augustine said. I think this is the only way to make sense of that sentence. He says, we disbelieve Virgil on grounds of common sense. But when evidence turns up, what we were already told by Virgil is confirmed by experience, and we have to revise our conclusions. Our objections to the age of the patriarchs has no better warrant than the same kind of common sense. And so that instinct gives us no grounds to reject what we were told before by Genesis. By such argument, Augustine strands the historical imagination in a permanent state of self-surveillance. That men were never so big seemed like a good assumption until the big tooth turned up. Indeed, until it did, there was no cause even to single it out as an assumption. Had the tooth not shown up, we would have no reason to look for it or even imagine that it might be there. Empirical reasoning cannot hope to recognize all of the assumptions it makes because it can't conceive of all the forms of evidence that might be looked for or might never be looked for because they are so wholly lost that they have never even been conceived. Of course, this is a generalized version of the argument that Augustine makes against identifying the providential import of particular historical events. You cannot know that you know the relevant context. You can never be sure that you know the relevant context, and therefore you can never be sure that you know the meaning of the event. Knowing that you cannot, shame hangs all such inferences about with skeptical qualifications. Shame looks not only for logical considerations that one might hope to master, but also for the contingent evidentiary considerations that always outrun such mastery. And in fact, the fact that Augustine's conclusion about that molar, this is his assumption that obviously it was human, the fact that that turns out to be false, as paleontological studies obviously show, just makes his point for him, that you can't know what might come to be known in the future. Now, the sense of impudent that I've outlined so far is not original to Augustine. If I had time, and if I thought you would care, I would show that it was a shared possession of classical rhetoric. Augustine's use of it is important for us, not because he uses it in some unusual sense, but because he so richly exemplifies its usual sense and chases so far down the trail of its conceptual implications. This sense remains a common possession of writing for centuries thereafter. It's this sense, for example, that Peter Abelard in the 12th century uses in his dialogue of a Christian, a philosopher, and a Jew. In that dialogue, the unbelieving philosopher had begun by declaring that Jews are foolish and Christians are crazy. He has gone on to defeat the Jew in debate. Then he turns to the Christian with flattery about how much truth he hopes to learn from the Christian. To this, the Christian replies that the philosopher's respectful address seems to clash shamelessly with his earlier talk about stupid Jews and mad Christians. How can you expect now instruction in truth from those you have judged insane? In the context, this is not a complaint, but a question. And the question is whether the philosopher holds himself responsibly enough to his own utterances to be worth trading utterances with. This is a good example of how justifiably, Augustine at least would claim, the ad hominem force of the impudence gambit works. Because the question is not about the philosopher's discourse, it's about his character. Is this man worth talking to? It's in this sense that Samuel von Pufendorf, actually I'm going to skip that one, just in the interest of time, and it's in this sense, I'm moving now on to the 18th century, and it's in this sense that Cardinal Gotti, remember him, calls Spinoza the most impudent of mortals. I quoted Jonathan Israel, who says that Gaudy is reduced to retorting that the truth of the testimony of the evangelists cannot be doubted. But that's not what Gaudy says. In the letters to Oldenburg, Spinoza's letters to Oldenburg, which Gaudy quotes, Spinoza says that the evangelists honestly thought they saw Christ rise and ascend corporally, but that they could have been mistaken, potuerant decebi, which can also mean they could have been deceived about it, because they had not understood that Jesus was a teacher of allegorical truth, whose resurrection was plainly spiritual, not bodily. To this, Gaudy replies, "It is you, most impudent of mortals, who are deceived, not the evangelists who recorded the things that they saw, and the things to which Christ himself testified, unless you say, as perhaps you would not blush to say, that they were deceived by Christ." His point seems to be not that the evangelist's testimony cannot be doubted, but that Spinoza has given no reason why it should be. That the evangelists offer empirical testimony to events he gives no empirical reasons for rejecting. And by his praise of Jesus as a spiritual and allegorical teacher, Spinoza has deprived himself of the only reasonable source of deceit that might be proposed. On the most generous reading, Gaudy seems to be saying, Spinoza has mistaken an a priori commitment for an a posteriori judgment, and Gaudy does not have to labor at answering it because it answers itself. So, I asked what these medieval and modern authors meant by impudent, and at this point we've got an answer. It's a good answer as far as it goes, but it's partly lost track of the question. Granted that it is a mistake to question something that one's argument presupposes, why is it impudence? It sounds like a harsh way to make a logical point. Lost my place. Impudence is a failure to be ashamed. What ought the impudent person be ashamed of? Or rather, because I've answered that question, why should the intensity of shame, pudor, attach to the defects of argumentative consistency? Surely this harshness, this intensity, is what seems to lay open these authors to our judgment of anxiety. This is where the investigation needs to turn now. Let's begin with the question of what shame, and therefore what shamelessness, means, and why it's used in this context. There have been a lot of good discussions of shame in recent decades, and these largely agree with each other and with our common sense and common usage, that shame fundamentally for us involves a shrinking from exposure, a shrinking that sometimes aspires to self-negation. In one of the most interesting such discussions, Bernard Williams says that shame is connected with being seen inappropriately by the wrong people in the wrong condition, that it is straightforwardly connected with nakedness, particularly in sexual connections, that it amounts to the wish to disappear, the wish that the space occupied by me should be instantaneously empty. It's not hard to get from such a phenomenological account of shame, because that's really what that is, to the idea that any desire to inflict such self-conscious discomfort on others implies an ambition to negate or annihilate them altogether, to make them disappear, and that such a fantasy of negating others in turn implies one's own acute self-consciousness that would need to negate others in that way. Thus, Elaine Pagels and William Connolly, to take two widely read instances, think that shame is basic to Augustine's apprehension of the world and becomes basic to the dark and coercive politics they associate with him because he needs to make everyone else be like him or disappear. Both Pagels and Connolly are thinking especially about Augustine's famous essay on sexual shame in The City of God. This remarkable discussion in Book 14 of The City of God is the most important context for the passages that I looked at a minute ago in Book 15 of the same work. And it gives us the most lucid portrait of the work of shame and shamelessness in the tradition that I'm talking about. Here we see clearly the failure that shame measures. See what it is a failure of. Augustine begins this discussion by asking whether the body's frailties are the cause or the effect of sin. And immediately on posing the question, he thinks of Virgil. He cites what he calls the Platonic account, Platonicam Sententiam, in Book 6 of the Aeneid, of how our bodies are injurious noxia corpora, how they weigh down our souls and depress the vigor we bring from our heavenly birthplace. Augustine, of course, rejects this opinion. A Christian has to regard the body as the victim and not the villain. So about the origin of shame, he differs explicitly from Virgil. But Virgil comes up here at all, because Virgilian shame is the model for Augustinian shame. They differ on its origin, but agree on its character. In both of them, shame is experienced as passion, but functions as knowledge. And in both of them, it's hard to recognize the shrinking, the quailing, the oppressive self-consciousness that Bernard Williams describes. Here's an instance from the Aeneid. In the funeral games for Anchises in Book 5, the boxing competition matches a confident young Dares against Entellus, a legendary but aging warrior and boxer. The older man is losing, throws a bad blow, he staggers himself. His mistake makes him flare with anger, so that shame and power self-aware, pudor et conscia virtus, kindled his strength. He rallies suddenly and nearly kills Dares. The shame kindles his strength, sets fire to it, the familiar Virgilian image of passion, but it is conscia virtus, power that has grown conscious of itself. The shame brings Entellus no wish to disappear, in William's phrase, not least because he's not conscious of appearing before anyone. He is so absorbed in the battle, so oblivious of those around him, he doesn't even notice that his friend Acestes is making a move to help him. He's not even his own audience. He's not regarding himself in a third-personal way. He does not measure himself against the figure that he would like to cut. He's measuring himself against the power that he knows he has. And this is how pudor, shame, consistently appears in the Aeneid. If I went through all the passages in which it does, you see it's exactly the same thing. Augustinian pudor is likewise an access of knowledge more than of passion, though like all knowledge, it can induce passion. It's an impulse toward assertion and accomplishment rather than toward inhibition. And conversely, in this Virgilian sense, impudence is not a show of mettle, it's a failure of knowledge. Of course, there is in Augustine a new element of which the Aeneid is innocent. The recognition of weakness of character, measuring oneself against oneself, is unneeded until there is fault and failure and self-deception in human life. That comes, in Augustine's view, after the fall. Shame comes with it. And sexual shame is the most vivid and abrupt of its guises. In Paradise, as Augustine famously speculates, unfallen Adam and Eve experienced sexual climax without blanking into momentary stupidity. In Paradise, the mind guided the organs of generation with the easy, unself-conscious grace it still enjoys when commanding hand and foot. With the fall, those sexual organs grew capricious and confounding. Their insubordination is a constant reminder of a selfhood that's scattered and imperfectly wielded. The body blandly ignores the directions of the mind, but the mind can't return the snub. Though estranged from the body in one sense, it's bound claustrophobically with it in another. It takes from the body's random and mechanical impulses desires it did not conceive as if it had conceived them, and once it has done so, it's routinely balked of their enjoyment by the body that provoked it. Unwanted arousal and untimely impotence are two sides of the phenomenon of confusion and self-estrangement that Augustine investigates in sexual life and as an origin of sexual shame. His descriptions are almost Ovidian in their elegance and parallelism of the bitter disappointment and paradox in sexual activity. Sexual excitement, he says at one point, begs for entrance when it has not been invited, but cools in the body when the mind is fired with desire. This is the sort of thing Julian of Eclanum is getting prim about when he complains of Augustine's potty-mouthed prurience. He names that phenomenon with a grim wit. He says that, he says that after the fall, Adam and Eve found in the bodily motions of their genitals an impudens novitas, an impudent surprise. So, in sex as elsewhere, impudence is not bold choice. It's not choice at all. That's the point. It's the unchosen reflex of the body working out a merely mechanical logic without the courtesy of notifying the mind. The genital action is impudent because it's untouched by evaluation and election. It's just a product of impulses randomly engaged that act on your choice rather than from it. It's a bodily mechanism that pulls thought and desire and imagination in tow. And the fallen mind resists itself, even as the body resists it. The mind proves unequal to controlling not only the body's impulses, but its own, and that's the source of the argumentative impudence that I discussed in the first half of this paper. Irresponsible assertion in the passages that we have seen are shameless in the same way that the sexual impudent surprise is shameless, seizing conclusions unwarranted by logic or evidence or consistency with the imperious non sequitur of an unwanted erection, but with a solemn conviction that it's all been quite rational. Such conclusions wear a sage look of rational consequence, but are hostage to impulse and inconsequentiality. Shame, correspondingly, is the consciousness, uncomfortably reinforced by pratfalls in both spheres, of your inconsistency, your inelasticity, of how little you belong to yourself. Because that's what it comes to. Augustine presents a picture in which my actions and my thoughts scarcely are actions or thoughts, and in fact are scarcely mine. Their look of reason and choice is a kind of mockery. So therefore is the freedom with which I fancy I am myself making them. So even is therefore the sense that I bring them forth, when they so obviously betide me. I routinely misapprehend their origins and their objects. I can find the choices and commitments that I've consciously made being nullified and even conspiring with their own nullification when the force of passion or habit asserts itself. But I still own them as my thoughts and actions once they are done. A self that's permeable to the accidents of its attachments, desires, and aversions in this way is, in a robust sense, not its own. But the self still recognizes and acknowledges this captivity, and so shows that there is a self that expects to be its own. Now, before pushing further into the last stages of the argument here, I want to pause to note that even this more fully specified usage, this more fully Augustinian usage, you might say, is not specific to Augustine, though, again, it's he who makes its logic easiest to trace. I will skip over the documentation of that fact and move to the next step of the argument, having said that. The tradition I've been describing feels, as I've said, to us a little alien. It understands shame and values shame differently from us. The capacity for shame is, in it, liberating. The incapacity for shame, constraining. A wonderful moment near the beginning of the Purgatorio gives this point imaginative substance. The souls at the base of the mountain, those who were excommunicated but have been saved and are now in heaven, or now in purgatory, appear somewhat less than self-possessed. When they see Dante's shadow, for example, those at the front of the group give way in surprise, and all the others who came next without knowing why did the same. He uses the metaphor of a flock, and in fact they're acting a little bit like sheep. They stop, they don't know what they're doing, they don't know where they're going at that moment. But they are also at the same time described as being shamefast, pudica, and dignified. That's the phrase he uses, shamefast and dignified. They are aimless, but this aimlessness is the refreshing first sign of and prerequisite to their eventual self-possession. Experiencing themselves, they enjoy the dignity of unconstraint and of disorientation, which he correlates with the dignity that he correlates with their shame. Choice, of course, is just what Dante's damned souls have lost. The unmotivated wandering of these redeemed souls is the sign of their freedom from that dull and permanent mechanism of infernal selfhood. What this suggests is that the failure diagnosed by the accusation of impudence, the misfire in minds and selves that abdicate the responsibilities when forming their utterances, is a failure of freedom and of the mind's capacity for engagement. The issue of freedom and unfreedom is obvious in Augustine's instance of lust in the fallen self. The body that can't control its responses leaves the soul at the mercy of whatever stimulus it happens to cross its path. And in the same way, the mind that jumps the rails of rational consequence when the passions take hold of it and become inflamed is a mind that is similarly at the mercy of whatever happens to be encountered and inflame those passions. To Augustine, of course, this assessment is explained by the doctrine of the fall, but it's an assessment most memorably defended by someone who centuries later rejected the doctrine of the fall. For this connection between the operation of the passions and the failure of free and integral personhood was made most efficiently by Gotti's nemesis, Spinoza. The fourth book of the Ethics, on the Passions is famously titled De Servitute Humana, on human slavery. It begins by asserting that, I'm quoting, a person exposed to his passions is in the power of accident, of fortuna, not in his own power, so that often he finds that though he sees the better course, he is forced to follow the worse. That last phrase, of course, paraphrasing Ovid. Such a person is hostage to accident, fortuna, because it carries the mind along with it. The passionate, the affective man, he says, is not sui juris, does not exercise jurisdiction over himself. In intellectual activity, this means that the passions carry the thought along with them, which is to say that when thinking under the sway of passion, you are not really thinking at all, and therefore you are not really thinking either. You are experiencing a sequence of thoughts that you have not produced and that do not produce each other, but are detonated by a chance sequence of objects that pull you along. Spinoza would have no objection to objection to plenty in Pascal, but he would have no objection to Pascal's declaration that a man's disordered desire settles his choice for him without consulting him, and he could have no objection to the principles that Gotti alleges when criticizing himself, that an animus has carried him beyond self-coherence, though of course he would dispute Gotti's application of it to him. There's a classic essay on Spinoza by Stuart Hampshire, in which he calls the bondage of the soul to passions a heteronomy not of the will but of the reason. But this seems actually to understate the case. First, you can choose to abdicate autonomy, what Spinoza describes as someone who cannot even manage to choose. But more important, the relevant concept would seem to be not heteronomy, but anomy, abandonment not to somebody else's program, but to just one damn thing after another. This idea, this overfamiliar idea, this almost trite idea that your reason must steer the ship if you want to think yourself its pilot, has of course a long and familiar career in classical and Christian philosophy up through Spinoza and long after. As we're often reminded, I'm just going over textbook stuff we all know, as we're often reminded, the sentence that most of us here first encountered in the English translation as where id was, there ego shall be, is actually wo es war, soll ich werden, where it was, I will be. And the opposition to this idea of reason's control has been no less enduring. Callicles, Nietzsche, Deleuze. This opposition has repeatedly suggested, in various ways, that the idea of a hierarchy of faculties, reason on top, passions down below, is a bad faith ideological naturalization of the facts of social power, which its claims to neutrality and universality have to conceal. Now, it seems to me that that's not a criticism to which Spinoza is vulnerable, since there is no hierarchy of faculties in his case. In any event, Spinoza's objection to the power of the affects isn't that they're less dignified than reason, it's that their operation is both impersonal, in that you don't give it purposive shape yourself, and it's unprincipled, it doesn't get purposive shape from somewhere else. So it's not something you do, it's something that intrudes on you. And it seems to me also that Spinoza's immunity to this critique shows, in fact, that there is no grounds for the critique, at least in that form at all. The image of the hierarchy is a figure that's decorative and disposable to the question that's really at the center of all these authors, from Aristotle through Augustine and beyond, the question of under what conditions you can think your thoughts and choose your choices, under what conditions you can meaningfully avow them and be held responsible for them. Now, I'm far out of my depth here, and I'm heading back to the shallow end even as I state that fact. But it's important to acknowledge the force of this picture, this classical Christian Spinozist Freudian picture, because the impudence gambit of our pre-modern and early modern thinkers presupposes it. Impudence is called when a speaker fails egregiously in coherence and control. Incoherence and control are pertinent norms in discourse. If they're not pertinent norms in discourse, if they're not possible, then their failure cannot reasonably be reprehended. Now, we late moderns are, of course, less prone to acknowledge that such rational control of discourse is possible or desirable, but so much the worse for us if we do, at least in our roles as historicist critics of literature and culture, because our anxiety gambit depends on it just as much as the impudence gambit does. Now, you would never know this from looking at most of the instances of the anxiety gambit in recent scholarship. In most of the instances I cited, and in hundreds of instances I might have cited, the mere description of an utterance seems thought to justify the diagnosis of anxiety. In most of these cases, what the evidence shows is utterances that are vehement, critical, self-important, pedantic, careful, elaborate, zany, resentful. What the diagnosis concludes in them is that the vehemence, the criticism, the self-importance, and the like are masks for defensive fear. But you only need to, and you only get to, diagnose what has gone wrong in utterances when you can show that something has, in fact, gone wrong, that a paralogism, a non sequitur, a disproportion or an omission or a mistake breaks the chain of argument or narrative, or that the rhetoric darts beyond or falls short of what's appropriate. You need to show that that vehemence is disproportionate or misplaced, or that the criticism is incoherent or baseless. And you cannot even imagine that you have found such a defect until you have reenacted the work's logic, can name where and how it goes wrong, can specify what would be appropriate in the context and why. Otherwise, the question has simply been begged. It has simply been begged. The question, to speak plain, has been begged a lot. Anxiety and hysteresis criticism has become, as I was suggesting at the beginning, as trite as irony and paradox and tension were in the old new criticism half a century ago. And this is surely one reason why symptomatic reading, as it's now called, that form of critique for which the anxiety gambit is an enabling gesture, has come under attack from so many different quarters in the last few years. By such intellectual and moral labor-saving devices, the anxiety gambit has besmirched its own reputation. It can come to hand as a quick way of buffing up a lack of interest as an analytic dismissal. It cultivates the unintelligent conviction that certain kinds of argumentative utterance are, in certain agents, always pathological. It allowed whole generations of medievalists to assume a knowingness about arguments that we hadn't bothered thinking our way through. It has, as I say, come under attack, and understandably so. But I'm not joining the attack, I'm joining its defense. It has been notoriously abused, but the abuse of a thing does not take away its legitimate use. There is nothing in principle wrong with explanations that take the form, author X thinks that she has a reason sufficient for making assertion B, but she does not have such a reason, so there must be some other cause of her making it. And that is the form that the anxiety gambit takes. It's also the form that the impudence gambit takes. And that's my point. I started out by observing that the two gambits look surprisingly alike. I'll now suggest they look alike because they're the same gambit. Some instances make this especially clear. The substance of Augustine's reproach to Julian of Eclanum, which I started with, what feels like 3 hours ago, that what Adam and Eve felt in their shame is worse to praise than to strip bare. The substance of his accusation of Julian there is that Julian's declared confidence in the goodness of sexual urges will not stand the test of a steady gaze. He's unwilling to name without euphemism what he complacently commends, and by this fastidiousness, he shows that he is uneasy in a way not very different from the uneasiness he locates in Augustine himself. The diagnosis of impudence in this passage, like those in the Trinity and the City of God, and like the diagnoses of anxiety in Kirby Fulton and Dinshaw and Greenblatt, identifies an apparent incoherence and explains it as the product of a misfire. The two gambits are the same gambit. And since they are, it could be no part of my remit here. I'm actually ending, by the way. It could be no part of my remit here to argue the superiority of either to the other, but the argumentative context in which the impudence gambit in these earlier centuries is typically found, and indeed what has seemed to make it so easy a mark for the anxiety gambit, does give it certain advantages, the advantage of a certain clarity. Its explicitly aggressive and polemical form, its willingness to acknowledge its ad hominem judgments, and indeed as ad hominem, acknowledges two things. First, it acknowledges explicitly the rational commitments that the judgment of impudence and the judgment of anxiety have to agree to accept if the judgment's to have any integrity. Issuing the judgment means being ready with reasons. Second, and by that fact, it acknowledges that the opponent is an interlocutor, someone who deserves reasons, someone whose utterances deserve response and not merely diagnosis, and who has a right to ask for those reasons. These acknowledgments simply spell out what the anxiety gambit, no less than the impudence gambit, agrees to by the form of interpretation it offers. To expect rational consistency, to acknowledge it when it's there, to resort to diagnosis only when it's shown not to be there. Far from dissolving the standards of reasoned coherence, it depends on them. It also acknowledges that reasons can be apprehended through time. Historical contingency and specificity do not call these standards into question. The standards are the precondition for even apprehending such specificity. The more respectfully criticism looks for the rational and imaginative consistency in its sources, the more powerfully and less formulaically its diagnoses will show when they do come. This is not just a better way of doing literary history, it's the only way of doing it. Concluding, I've mentioned how the Christian, in Abelard's dialogue of the philosopher, the Jew, and the Christian, challenges the philosopher with trimming. The philosopher's praise of Christians seems to clash impudently with his earlier boast that Jews will prove to be stupid and Christians crazy. By floating that charge of impudence, the Christian asks, in effect, whether the philosopher is willing to stand by his assertions with argument or will just cave before a challenge and prove himself too trivial to argue with. I didn't tell you what happened next. This challenge actually makes sense to the philosopher, who replies that, in fact, that initial insulting boast was a device by which he hoped to rouse the Christian and the Jew to their sharpest performance in argument. Sometimes, he says, people can be brought more readily to give themselves eagerly to argument by insult and reproach than by a more courtly request. And that explanation, in turn, makes perfect sense to the Christian, who says so, accepts the explanation, and moves straight to the debate, which absorbs them for the rest of the work. A person can see their point. An interlocutor cannot be worth talking to unless he can admit that you could be right, and you won't be worth talking to unless you can admit that he might be. It seems to me we should assume that the same is true when we read our sources. Here I'm speaking largely to the historicist critics in the room, which I suppose is me. We should assume that the same is true when we read our sources. If we rush to diagnose where our sources go wrong without pausing to inquire patiently whether they are right, then we've shown ourselves to be merely trifling. Thanks for your patience.